Cool. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Today's November 21st, 2024. It's the bi-weekly SIG Instrumentation meeting. Just a couple topics on the agenda. The first is that the leads are going to update their emails in some community YAML file. The second one is mine. So let me present maybe. It's this one. So for this, I do finally have this all working. But basically, let's see what's useful to show here. What this does is it moves the filter after authorization, like we discussed. The only downside of that is that we don't get any traces from the authorization filter anymore. But that's not, I don't think, a huge deal. And then it allows either system master or system monitoring to control tracing, which I think will be really useful in the future. So I'm really excited about this. I was able to fix the start time issue. So now it's actually, it turns out for metrics, there's already a start time, a context-based start time thing. It's called this received timestamp. So for the Prometheus metrics, it's already fetching the start time from context and using it. So now we can just do the exact same thing for trace, which is nice because we'll have identical start times between the Prometheus metrics and the hotel tracing. And this is using the context with start time function I added to OpenTelemetry's HTTP library.
How are you testing this?
So I have wrong button. So previously, the way that we were testing tracing was setting the sampling rate to 100% and then running through different scenarios and verifying that we found the expected trace. Mm-hmm. Now what we're doing is we're leaving the sampling rate at 0 and then sending with each request a sampled context. Let me find that. So now we can basically generate a sampled context with a random trace ID, a random span ID, and set the context to explicitly be sampled. And then as long as we use this context when we make requests, so like you can see here, when we make this API call, we pass a context in, and we use that context in the request. That's a way for us to force sampling. And it turns out that the client config that we get back, let me see if I can find it somewhere. Test server. Yeah, this test server.client config that we're using is already system master. So all of this just works as is today.
Does that mean that we don't need the other sampling rate config anymore? Or is that another way to get your traces in?
So there's two stories here. One story is I want some background level of tracing to happen automatically all the time, right? So the cluster is just running, it's operating normally. I want to kind of get a small number of spans out of Kubernetes so that if I want to ask questions about what's going on, like let's say I look at a metric and it looks slightly abnormal, I should be able to find an exemplar maybe with a trace that shows me what was going on there. I didn't explicitly, when I sent the request, ask for it to be sampled, but I'd like some small number of requests to be sampled in the background, no matter what. So that's where the sampling rate comes in. What this does is that we had discussed like maybe doing kubectl apply and then having a -- trace option or something like that, where you could explicitly ask for a particular request to be sampled. This
Right.
enables that story so long as you're in the system
Got it.
monitoring group.
So that does mean that we are supporting two ways to have traces.
There's two ways to influence sampling, right? One is
Yeah.
by setting the sampling rate,
Right.
and the other is by being a privileged user and
Yep.
sending a sampled request.
Nice.
Yeah, so I'm actually going to split out the dependency update for OTel into its own PR. And I think we're also in code freeze, so I don't think this will merge right away. But
Right.
I'll do the dependency update, and then I'll mark this ready for review after that. So hopefully this will get in, and then that'll be the only item left for GA for API server tracing, and kubelet tracing is already done. I checked with the folks on the node side of things.
Nice. Excited.
Cool. And then the next topic is, let me do this. The next topic is also mine. And this is about following a discussion I had with Patrick about how to do trace context in logs. So the end result that we want is we want to be able to have trace ID and span ID attributes, right, in the log lines that correspond to the context that's associated with the trace, right? There's a couple different options for how to do this. The Klog has a with values function. So if we look at, let's go check out the PR. So at the end of the day, the important thing is that something needs to call with values on a logger at some point. That can either happen at the log site, so right, like wherever we're about to do a klog.info or something, we could at that point fetch the trace ID and span ID from context and attach those values to the logger before we call the info function, right? Another option is that we add this to klog, and whenever klog does a from context to get a logger from a context, it also attaches the appropriate trace ID and span ID to that logger. So that's another option. Another option would be the flip side, or another option would be that when we start a span, we put a logger with the trace ID and span ID in the context that we return along with the span. So this would be adding the logging side of things to the trace calls. And so that's what Patrick and I are trying to discuss here. But if people are interested, you're welcome to join in. One of the concerns that I had initially is that for some of the options, we could end up adding the trace ID and span ID to a logger multiple times. For example, if you took a logger out of the context and then made some modifications to it and then put it back in the context, you would be adding the trace ID and span ID in the from logger call in like the second option that I talked about. But then if you did that multiple times, you don't want to end up with 6 trace IDs and 6 span IDs, right? You only want the latest one. So Patrick also just put up today a PR to deduplicate key value pairs, which would be helpful for this scenario in particular. And surprisingly, he said that normally the concern with deduplication is that it takes a pretty significant performance hit. But apparently this is in the normal case, not expensive.
So then, out of the three ways that you described to add the tracing, like the trace IDs and the span IDs to the logs, are we going to use the second one where we are modifying where the klog calls?
So if we modify klog, the biggest concern there is that then klog takes on a dependency on the OpenTelemetry trace API. The trace API is quite small. It just has a few interfaces in it. But that still is a concern for them because they really, really, really try and avoid taking dependencies in klog.
Got it.
We'll have to see then. It may be best then for us to wrap the OTel tracer API and do the logging whenever we start a span, or do the addition of trace ID and span ID whenever we start a span.
Got it. Is it possible to list down these three alternatives somewhere? Or is it
Yeah,
already somewhere?
I think there's an issue for this, right? Issue is this trace ID and span IDs contextual logging. So it might be good.
Yeah, to maybe add some notes here.
Yeah.
And from what I can remember from last time, wasn't this blogged on contextual logging getting GA for API server? It wasn't done everywhere in API server.
Right. So all of this, we can still work on figuring out how it should work.
Yeah.
Basically, like we can design it and implement it in component base or in klog or anywhere else where we need this. And then basically, whenever the API server does transition to contextual logging, it'll just magically pick up. It's sort of like the work you did with exemplars, right? Where we've implemented the core pieces, but people still have to call with context.
Right. Yep. Got it. Cool.
Okay. Any other topics people have? Do you need any help with the release-related stuff for
Z pages?
For Z pages.
No, I think there's just one open PR about the docs. I don't think I have any other pending items. I was thinking of having a blog for it, but I'm not so sure now. Deadline is, I don't know, this week sometime.
Do you need review on it, or do you have a reviewer?
For the docs PR?
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, I do need a reviewer for it. I think that somebody from Docs, SIG Docs is going to take a look at it, but they might ask me to get a LGTM from SIG Instrumentation too. Let me mention that here. Yeah, thanks for reminding me.
Yep. Cool. Any topics from anyone else? We still have 10 minutes left, so. All right. Then I think we can leave 10 minutes early. It's good to see everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.